Europe, the Southeast. One kingdom, three rulers, their consorts, their heirs, and none of them destined to be happy. And the kingdom? The kingdom was doomed.
I was very young when I lost my father, and 3 years later we had to bid farewell to favorite places, to many people, some of which I never saw again. And I returned to my homeland after 50 years in exile.
This story is the missing page from the common European history book. It has never been told before. Tsar Boris stayed on the train to see off his father and brother to the next station. It was already dark when he climbed into his car and sped back to Sofia. The city was asleep when the car halted at the northern palace entrance. A uniformed guard threw open the black iron gate, stood to attention, and saluted. Behind the door of his private rooms, Boris was alone. His few confidants had departed. The spirit of Tsar Ferdinand still made its presence felt around the empty halls. After a dramatic night, Bulgaria woke to the sound of church bells over town and village. A new hope dawned on the suffering nation. A new captain stood at the helm as the ship was sinking. A sensitive 24-year-old who the day before had not been at all sure whether he wanted to be Tsar. His enthusiastic subjects cheered him as he passed by Dundukov Boulevard on his way to the coronation ceremony. He wore a simple greatcoat with general's epaulettes. Pale and moved by the liturgy, Boris stood by the cathedral throne, entranced by the chants of the church choir. By lunchtime on October the 4th, he had signed his first executive order for the demobilization of the army. The commanding officers of the Sofia garrison waited later that day at the military club in order to swear allegiance to him. 200 men in immaculate uniforms stood to attention in the ballroom when the Tsar appeared, followed by the Minister of War. Boris wore his general's uniform and looked at least 10 years older. He never felt as lonely as he did in the early years of his reign. Boris spent his evenings with his closest associates, the few men he knew, trusted, and who remained with him in the palace. One evening, after a long silence, he told his secretary, "You have no idea how lucky you are. You have no inkling of the horrors of war. I have seen so much suffering, so much death, cruelties you will find impossible to believe even if you had seen them with your own eyes. One could never hope to forget this horror. Then suddenly his voice hardened. I will tell you this, though. As long as I am Tsar, no Bulgarian soldier will ever go to war. I swear it. A Tsar rules, but does not govern. This golden rule of every constitutional monarchy was enshrined in the Bulgarian constitution, but was not strictly observed. To Boris's misfortune, at the time of his ascent, power was in the hands of an extraordinary reformer, audacious populist, and veritable storm of a man. Alexander Stamboliski was the fiery leader of the Agrarian Party and a virtual dictator. He took it upon himself to transform the country politically, socially, and economically, and he set about it with remarkable gusto and self-confidence. He aimed to place power squarely in the hand of the peasantry, and he reached far and wide in attempting to achieve his goal. Stamboliski's effort bore fruit, but the means were often brutal. Some ideas of this homegrown dictator, like the introduction of universal compulsory labor conscription in lieu of military service, or the creation of a green international of agrarian parties in Europe, attracted the attention of the world. Stamboliski proudly said, "The agrarian union in this country has reached a zenith." It is now more powerful than ever. We can be sure that all other nations will emulate us. His regime tackled the civil service, the army, the legal and financial system. He removed educational requirements and opened civil service jobs to large numbers of illiterate party activists, and initiated a spelling reform. But strangely enough, for the head of a Republican movement, stopped short of abolishing the monarchy, despite the fact that 3 of Europe's largest empires crumbled in the aftermath of the Great War. The continent was going through what retrospectively became known as the interbellum. Britain was the only surviving empire. Meanwhile, an unprecedented revolution in transportation took place that shrank distances and made the world smaller, but no more predictable. An Italian journalist wrote, "There can be no more tragic ascent to the throne in the history of peoples than that of Boris III." Bulgaria was a much-changed country. The land resembled a mighty bivouac, dotted with half-extinct fires. Calls to rebellion and devastation resonated across the country. Yet to part with his longtime allies, Boris had to receive representatives of the Entente, who came with the arrogance of victors. The unbearably onerous clauses of the cruel Armistice Treaty were yet to be fulfilled. The Tsar survived an assassination attempt by communist and anarchist plotters. He and his attendants were ambushed at the Ottoman Pass. In the midst of the shootout, Boris got away at the wheel of his own car and later switched to a bus. Several hours after the ambush, a senior army general and current MP was accosted and killed in front of the St. Sedmochislensi Church in downtown Sofia. General Kosta Georgiev had entered politics after a brilliant military career. His murderers got away, and their motives remained temporarily unclear. But not for long. On April the 16th, crowds of people thronged the streets as the funeral procession made its way to the St. Nedelya Cathedral for the service. The procession arrived at 15:20. The cathedral was packed with mourners. Standing at the episcopal throne, Metropolitan Stepan scanned the capital city's elite. Only the Tsar was missing. Boris was having a tough day. In the morning, he was at the village of Belyiskar for the funeral of his hunting companion who had been killed at Arabakonak. And then he returned to Sofia for a send-off of another one of the victims. Leaving the palace on his way to the funeral of General Georgiev, the Tsar heard a deafening explosion. the central dome of the cathedral collapsed on top of the crowd, burying hundreds. "193 died, and more than 500 were wounded. The terrorist act had been organized by the military wing of the Bulgarian Communist Party. More Bulgarian generals and senior officers died in that act of terror than in all the wars of modern Bulgarian history put together. A great many of the victims were decorated veterans, heroes of the Serb-Bulgarian War, the First and Second Balkan Wars, and the First World War. Women, children, pupils, students, and disabled people perished too. And after darkness, there was light again. Princess Giovanna of Savoy first saw Tsar Boreas on September the 25th, 1927. He had been invited to lunch by her parents, the King and Queen of Italy. Giovanna was shy in Boris's presence, but the gossip columns had already linked her romantically to the unmarried Bulgarian monarch. Their pictures had appeared together in the illustrated magazines. In a way, this was absurd. The two had never met. Boris, however, had been the subject to increasing pressure to ensure the succession and was contemplating a liaison with one of the available European princesses. Giovanna was first on the list. He could not have married a Bulgarian woman, as in tune with the Ternavo Constitution, Bulgaria was lacking aristocracy. Giovanna was vivacious and carefree. She wore modern clothes, was well acquainted with contemporary theater and music, and liked to dance, ski, and play tennis. Her life looked far more appealing, peaceful, and sunny than his had ever been. Her parents weren't about to force marriage upon her. Giovanna and Boris met again in January 1930, and he proposed to her in spite of being aware of the insurmountable obstacles to their union. The Pope could hardly be expected to give his blessing for the wedding between an Orthodox ruler and a Catholic princess. The Vatican had already tasted defeat with baby Boris's baptism brouhaha. Even though his father, Ferdinand, had promised to make him Catholic, the young prince eventually ended up Orthodox. The papal nuncio de Sofia, Cardinal Angelo Roncalli, and the future father-in-law, King Victor Emmanuel, intervened on the young couple's behalf and succeeded in overcoming the Vatican's disapproval. A date was to be set, but the monarch was concerned that this was no time for lavish spending and wanted a modest ceremony. Prime Minister Lyubchev spoke for the government and the majority of the citizens when he said, "We may not be as rich as the Italians, but we will show the world that we know how to organize a wedding for our Tsar." Victor Emmanuel offered that the dowry money be put in a bank account in Boris's name. The old king knew his future son-in-law had no money of his own. Boris refused. No, better leave everything in her name. That way, if I'm killed, at least the money would serve her and the family. Two days later, Boris made a short trip to Munich in order to visit his father and ask about the diadem Maria Louisa was given as a gift from the nation. The young Tsar came home in a good mood. His father had agreed to give it to him and had thrown in a jewel of Boris's grandmother Clementina's. Ferdinand also promised to attend the wedding. The Kingdom of Italy, Assisi, the St. Francis Cathedral, the young bride's favorite church. It is October the 25th, 1930. St. Francis and his town hold a special place in the heart of the religious Italian princess Giovanna of Savoy. The guardian saint of the poor and animals is among the best loved in Christianity. On the special day, the nave of the church looked splendid. A long line of trains and thousands of cars brought throngs of merry people to the steep and narrow streets of Assisi. Tens of newspaper correspondents descended on the town. The sidewalks were packed with dense crowds, barely contained by royal guardsmen and militia volontaria in dress uniforms. Tsar Boris arrived in the car of the Italian king. At this moment, a powerful lightning struck the cathedral square, and torrential rain and hail lashed the cobblestones. People stoically remained in their places and chanted the old Italian agate. A bride soaked by rain will have 100 years of happiness. The ceremony was made brief. The groom took the bride under his arm and led the cortege towards the lower church, where the tomb of St. Francis is located. Old Tsar Ferdinand wore a Bulgarian general's overcoat. Prince Kirill was there, and so was Princess Eudokia. Benito Mussolini in tailcoats came at the head of his entire cabinet, accompanied by the Bulgarian government led by Andrei Lyapchev, and a beeline of royalty and aristocracy. The bride and groom signed the papers at the altar containing St. Francis's body. Later, Boris and Giovanna signed the deed of civil marriage, with Benito Mussolini officiating in person. The couple drove off towards Villa Constanzi for the official dinner with 300 guests in attendance. The port of Brindisi, Giovanna and Boris's honeymoon trip started here. Tsar Ferdinand was the best of the three Bulgarian passenger steamers and had been painted a gleaming white for the occasion. Giovanna boarded the ship while its orchestra played romantic songs. After a few days, Tsar Ferdinand traversed the Bosphorus and was met by the entire Bulgarian naval fleet, which saluted it with all guns blazing. In Sofia, a gilded carriage carried the newlyweds through streets decorated with garlanded arches as the populace streamed to the St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral. Princess Giovanna received the blessing of the Orthodox Church and became Tsarina Giovanna. Sofia held its breath and waited. Gun salutes echoed around the city. Therefore, the eagerly awaited news had finally come true. The royal couple had been blessed with a child. After the 21st, the guns fell silent. So the child was a princess. She was christened Maria Luisa after Tsar Boris's mother. For Giovanna, her mother-in-law was a romantic figure. And what about relations with the Vatican? The Orthodox ceremony in Sofia had enraged Pope Pius XI. But Boris was not Catholic and could not be excommunicated. The Vatican's influence in 1930 was not of the same order that it had been in 1895, when Ferdinand had reneged on his promise. The world had changed so much that the Orthodox baptism of a Bulgarian royal child could hardly be expected to make an impression in Europe. Even the King and Queen of Italy were not particularly bothered either. The Duke, Benito Mussolini, sent word to the Tsar. Tell His Majesty that even if the Vatican tries to do something, he should pay no attention. We live in the 20th century. If God exists at all, he is neither Catholic nor Orthodox. He is the same for everyone. During the course of their marriage, the only time Boris and Giovanna had to themselves was during the day in Vrana Palace. They took a regular half-an-hour walk around the park, played with their dogs, and chatted with the gardeners before returning to Sofia. They spoke French to each other. Of the other palaces, Boris liked Yuksenovgrad best and hunted at Tsarska Bistrica. Like his father, he had encyclopedic knowledge of botany, zoology, and machines. He worked in close cooperation with the head of the Royal Museum of Natural History, Dr. Buresh. He read voraciously and widely, but was expected to be interested in science and history. The Tsar could fix any car. When new locomotives were being delivered, he made himself a member of the evaluation committee so that he could test them personally. June the 16th, 1937, Sofia, the Alexander Nevsky Square. The St. Alexander Nevsky Church was the main cathedral building of the Bulgarian monarchy. This time, the gun salutes signifying the birth of a royal child didn't stop at 21 as they did when Maria Luisa first saw the light of day. They counted off to 101. But as soon as people heard the 22nd one, they flocked in the streets, hugging and rejoicing at the news that Bulgaria had a male heir. Little did they know how brief his tenure would be. Tsar Boris had desired a son wholeheartedly and was filled with joy. The whole nation rejoiced with him. Celebrations went on for days. In tune with popular will, the monarch decided to name his son after the most remarkable Tsar the country had ever had, Simeon I the Great. The baptism ceremony into the Orthodox faith took place on July the 12th in the Palace Chapel. In 1938, Tsar Boris and Tsarina Giovanna took a summer trip around Europe. First, they met with Benito Mussolini in Italy, and then went on to Britain to spend time with their relatives, King George's family. Boris also held talks with the most influential members of the British government. The world was going through the worst crisis of the last decade. Hitler's Germany had already annexed Austria and was now setting eyes on Czechoslovakia and its German-majority Sudeten region. Britain was ready to make all sorts of concessions to avoid conflict with Germany. In London, Tsar Boris related Mussolini's desire for improving Italian-British relations. The offer was met with great interest, since it came from Germany's closest ally. The Bulgarian royal family went next to Berlin. Boris put behind him all vanity and in the midst of an unprecedented world crisis, assumed the role of unofficial go-between. He was well placed to do so, as he was related to the ruling house of one side and an ally to the other. In September, he met with Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring. They were in a warlike mood. The Tsar warned them that it would be sheer madness for Germany to start a conflict. England will surely fight and will be supported by its dominions. London is slow to declare war, but once it has started, it will fight to the bitter end. 4 days after this encounter, the French and British prime ministers met the Führer and the Duke in Munich and agreed to let Germany reoccupy the Sudeten. On July the 26th, 1940, Hitler and Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop summoned the prime ministers and foreign ministers of Bulgaria and Romania in order to discuss the peaceful resolution of the Dobruja question. During the Second Balkan War in 1913, Romania attacked an already struggling Bulgaria that was fighting Serbs and Greeks and tore off southern Dobruja. In 1940, most great powers believed that the majority of the Bulgarian populated area must be returned to Bulgaria. However, Boris stood no chance in arguing his country's case for Macedonia and Thrace. Yugoslavia and Greece were traditional protégés of Britain and France. In June 1940, the new right-wing Romanian government sought a closer understanding with Germany, and it became clear that Bucharest would not resist too hard if it was made to return southern Dobruja. All of a sudden, Germany, Britain, Soviet Russia, Italy, and even the US were scrambling for the peacemakers' laurels in resolving the Bulgarian-Romanian territorial dispute. Tsar Boris was equally suspicious of both the Germany's and Britain's true motives in doing so. "Unless I am very much mistaken," he wrote to Bulgarian ambassador to Berlin, "the British hope that we will become the bone of contention between the eagle and the bear." The Tsar recommended that the Bulgarian diplomats exercise caution, circumspection, and moderation. In the end, his plan succeeded. Bulgarian and Romanian delegations met on August 19, 1940, in Craiova, and after difficult negotiations, arrived at an agreement. It was signed on September the 7th. Bulgaria received back southern Dobruja, with the towns of Silistra and Balchik. On September the 21st, the Bulgarian Third Army crossed the border, reoccupied this ancient Bulgarian domain to an ecstatic reception by the local population. In his speech before the National Assembly, Tsar Boris thanked the German and Italian governments. The British were mentioned too, but rather mutedly. The USSR was not officially given any credit for the success, and only a few communist and opposition leaders expressed gratitude. Bulgarian apprehension was quickly confirmed. The British plenipotentiary minister to Sofia, George Rendell, evaluated the situation thus. Dobruja was formally ceded to Bulgaria under German and Italian patronage, and therefore popular gratitude went the way of our sworn enemies and hurt our cause in Bulgaria immeasurably. Many who wavered and had not decided in favor of the Germans were swept along in the wave of popular enthusiasm. The war that started in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland inexorably evolved into the Second World War. The pressure on Bulgaria to take sides grew after Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact in September of 1940. The Foreign Minister of Germany, von Ribbentrop, invited Bulgaria to formally join in, and in a phone conversation with Bulgarian officials, insisted that it do so within 3 days. Tsar Boris's tactics of buying time proved futile. He had resolved to remain neutral, but was subject to relentless pressure. On October the 17th, Mussolini informed him of his intention of occupying Greece by the end of the month, and mentioned that this fact would enable Bulgaria to renew its just aspirations for an outlet on the Aegean Sea. Hitler invited Boris to Berlin. Bulgaria was faced with a choice, to either allow the Germans in or be occupied by the Wehrmacht. In Sofia, Boris met with the head of U.S. intelligence, Admiral William Donovan. The colonel gave him an ultimatum: under no circumstances to allow the passage of German troops through Bulgarian territory. Boris realized the U.S. was preparing for war too. Bulgaria was in a quandary. The fateful choice was made in 1941. Bulgaria joined the Axis powers of Italy, Germany, and Japan, together with Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia. 2 years later, the entire world would be against them. Tsar Boris succumbed to the pressure that plagued him. He died unexpectedly on August 28, 1943, and suspicions remain to this day that he was poisoned. He was 49. His sudden death symbolized the hopelessness of the situation. The Third Bulgarian Kingdom was moving into the shadows. Boris's funeral turned symbolic too. The entire nation seemed to have gathered in Sofia for the funeral ceremony. According to his wishes, the Tsar was buried in his beloved Rila monastery. In 1946, his remains were disinterred on the orders of the new communist masters of Sofia. They were reburied in a small chapel on the grounds of the Vrana Palace Park. In 1947, the communists blew up the grave and destroyed all signs of its existence. His heart, however, was discovered in a glass jar and reburied 46 years later. The place was the St. John of Rila Chapel in the Rila Monastery, and his wife Giovanna and daughter Maria Luisa in attendance. Twice baptized, twice buried, here and in the great beyond. Such was the fate of this man. Do we remember the secret whispers emanating from Shakespeare's grave in the Trinity Church of Stratford-upon-Avon? Do not disturb these bones or move them even if you are a Christian, or you will be cursed. What was the fate of those grave desecrators? They were not Christians for sure. Better eat black bread than see women wear black headscarves while mourning their loved ones who perished in war. Such was the belief of the dead man. But black headscarves were unavoidable. Bulgaria took no part in the war, yet the Allies bombed it heavily, causing considerable casualties and mass destruction. In Sofia alone, there were 12,000 buildings that were reduced to shells. Subsequent to the Tsar's death, a 3-member Regents Council took control of the state in the name of 6-year-old Tsar Simeon II. The Soviet troops were fast advancing on Bulgaria, and communist terrorist activities in the country reached a fever pitch. The rulers hoped that they would not be forced to negotiate with the Russians, opting for the West instead, for they knew that Russian involvement meant that communists would take power. But the US and Great Britain declined to participate in a secret meeting with a Bulgarian delegation unless their Soviet allies were there too. That marked the end. Not long after, the Bulgarian communists took over. Tsarina Giovanna was subjected to constant harassment. Her retinue was immediately replaced with people loyal to the coup leaders. The newly formed People's Militia conducted numerous searches in the palace. The monarchy was reduced to nearly a fiction and barely tolerated for 2 more years. Little Tsar Simeon, his sister, Princess Maria Louisa, and their mother, Giovanna, were allowed to live in Vrana until a 1946 referendum abolished the monarchy. The royal family was given 48 hours to leave the country. Prince Kirill did not leave with them. After the coup, he, the members of the Regents' Council, ministers from 3 cabinets, many MPs, and a significant number of intellectuals were tried and shot. The sentences were passed by a hastily assembled People's Court. With this came the end of the Third Bulgarian Kingdom. Over the course of 68 years, Bulgarians went through many challenges and death. Not one of the 3 monarchs that ruled it was happy. Not one died at peace with himself or the world. The circumstances of Prince Battenberg's burial had been particularly painful for his sister. Old Tsar Ferdinand was never allowed to visit the graves of his sons, both of whom predeceased him. Both died tragic deaths.
My soul thirsts for God, the living God. When can I go and meet with God? You, God, are my God. Earnestly, I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water.
And so it was with the 3 Bulgarian kingdoms. Each one of them crumbled to dust. But God is with us, and with them.
Simeon.